This happened in the summer of 2010, when I was just entering my teenage years. My family took a trip to a really nice hotel in the city. I can't recall why we decided to take the trip, but I do remember a lot of family friends coming along and staying in the adjacent rooms. To preface, I'm a bit of a scaredy cat, and I've always been. I was pretty skinny and fragile, so I would get frightened easily. In this instance, however, was definitely not me freaking myself out as I normally do. Looking back, I'm incredibly lucky I trusted my instincts. This hotel had a very strange design to it. The lobby was actually on the 4th floor, not the bottom, which I found odd. To access the lobby, you had to use the elevator. There was no way for you to get to it from the stairs. This information would have been nice before everything happened, as you'll soon find out. The hotel was organized in a square shape. Every floor was aligned with a balcony, and you could look down into the lobby area from your floor. I was afraid that I would fall over the balcony and sail down 8 stories to my death, but they were high enough that I wasn't too concerned for my safety. The first couple of days were nice. My friends and I hung out and played cards, or watched whatever was on TV. At night, we would explore the halls of the hotel and tell each other ghost stories. It was a really fun time, even though I fully didn't understand why we were there. On the 3rd day, though, things got strange fast. I woke up to the sound of screaming coming from outside my room. Now, because of the hotel's design that I mentioned, sounds in the lobby would echo all the way to the top of the building. So when I walked outside to investigate, I immediately looked over the balcony to see what the commotion was about. There was a girl lying on the ground. What looked like eggs and milk were splattered everywhere around her. People in the lobby were rushing to help her, and I heard a couple of them telling each other to call 911. It seemed like the girl was unconscious. Maybe she had passed out or something. I scanned the lobby and saw that my family and a few of my friends were in the lobby getting breakfast. I decided to rush down to meet them and to find out what happened. The elevator was on the opposite side of my floor, so I took the stairwell located right next to my room. We were on the 7th or 8th floor, so I knew I only had to go 4 flights down. Not a big deal. I descended for a bit, looking for the number 4 on the wall. I passed floor 5, ready to find the door that led to the lobby. I took about 2 more flights of steps before realizing that there hadn't been a lobby door, nor was there an entryway to the 3rd or 2nd floors. Now, at this point, I probably should have turned back, but I continued down because I was tired and I didn't want to climb back up. There were some weird side hallways that led into dark areas where a bunch of piping and wiring were, and though I was curious, I passed them by, making my way to the bottom floor. I soon reached a dimly lit cold room with cinder blocks and concrete floors. In front of me was a set of double doors. I hesitated at first, but I assumed that this was just another way back to the lobby, so I opened them and entered. Behind the doors was a massive warehouse-type room, probably the size of a small basketball stadium. The only light coming in was from the stairwell behind me, so I really wasn't able to see much. Tables lined the walls, and in the distance I thought I saw boxes stacked unlined. This was probably some kind of storage room for the hotel. I looked around and saw an elevator in the back of the room, so I made my way towards it, closing the door to the stairwell, and began to walk into the dim light. The room was super muggy and dusty, and it seemed like nobody had been down here for quite some time. As I approached the elevator, I noticed that it was slightly bigger than the elevators in the lobby and the other floors. I pressed the up button, but I got no response. There was a card swiper next to the button. This must have been for employees only. I turned back toward the stairwells, making my way past the chairs and tables along the wall. When I got to the door, I tried opening it. Locked, of course. This is when things started to hit me. I realized that I was stuck in a dark, dusty basement of a hotel. I didn't have a phone, so I couldn't call anyone. And everyone likely assumed that I was still asleep in my room. So I began to freak out, believing that nobody was going to come and look for me. I searched around the warehouse, looking for other ways out. Some areas were more visible than others, so I looked around in the areas I could see better before starting on the darker side of the room. There was another set of doors that I found, but they were locked as well. I was becoming very upset and was scared that no one would ever find me in this basement. After what felt like hours, I heard a door crack open. It wasn't the door from the stairwell. It was the second set of doors I found. A slim, middle-aged man in a lab coat came out of the doors. Now, if this was 21-year-old me seeing this man, I would be very confused as to why this man was wearing a lab coat in a hotel. But I was only 12 or 13 at the time, so I was just relieved at the sight of an adult. I approached him, tears in my eyes, and he immediately looked very surprised to see me. What are you doing down here? I got lost on my way down to the lobby, and I got locked in here. Do you have a key? I was shaking, eager just to get out of there. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he said, I know a way out of here. Follow me. He began to walk towards the stairwell doors, and I followed, relieved that somebody had finally come to save me. We approached the doors. I began to reach for the handle, but he just continued walking. Isn't this it right here? I will never forget the look on his face when I said that. He had a nervous expression, and though it was dim, I could see sweat glistening from his forehead. No, it's this way, he said sternly. I continued to follow him, but now I was nervous too. We passed the door to the stairs, and were now heading toward the darker side of the basement, away from the elevators. It appeared that he had no clue where he was leading me, as he just kept checking around him, almost as if he was taking in his surroundings for the first time. We turned a corner and began walking toward the boxes. I could see that it was a dead end. I immediately froze, realizing that something was very, very wrong. This man had no idea where he was going, nor did he appear to work at the hotel. Where are we going? I said in a nervous voice. He turned to me and said, It's this way, just follow me. I knew that there were no doors by those boxes. That was one of the first places I checked after I realized the stairwell doors were locked. I would like to thank whatever God is up there for gifting me with the idea I had next. I started yelling as loud as I could. I yelled so loud that I gave myself a headache. The man became irritated and plugged his ears. What the hell are you doing? Be quiet. I continued to yell. I don't even remember how long I was yelling for. Finally, the man snapped and began quickly walking towards me. I went into a full sprint, heading for the stairwell, hoping that the doors would somehow magically open. The man didn't run after me. He just walked sternly behind me, muttering something like, "Stupid kid." I was about 5 feet from the door when somebody burst through. It was a hotel janitor who heard the screaming from the stairwell. He saw the situation. Me and some random guy in a lab coat inside of a locked basement. He told me to get behind him. The janitor then asked me who that man was. I said I had no idea, and that he had come through the doors on the other side of the room. The janitor quickly radioed into the desk that he had found a child in the basement. He then said quietly, "There's also this other man here. He came from outside. Get security." The man in the lab coat tried arguing with the janitor, claiming that he was simply looking for a bathroom and took a wrong turn. But the janitor clearly wasn't buying it and kept saying things like, "Wait until security gets here and you can talk to them about it." I was standing beside him the whole time, trying to take in what was happening, confused out of my mind. Eventually, an employee from the front desk arrived and took me back up the steps to the lobby, where I met with my family, who surprisingly had no idea I was missing. I told them the story, crying and shaking. My mom hugged me tightly, thanking the employee over and over for their help. But I never got to thank that janitor though. He was the real hero. Looking back now, I have absolutely no idea what that man was doing in the basement. I don't have any information as to what happened afterwards, or who he was. I know for a fact that the incident with the girl in the lobby was completely unrelated. I've thought about that day a lot, and the only explanation I can put together is that the door I found in the basement led to the streets of the city where the man must have wandered in from. I have no clue what his intentions were, or why he was wearing a lab coat, and why he was acting like he knew his way around when it was obvious that he didn't. I suppose it's possible that this is all just one big misunderstanding, and I just chose a really bad time to get lost. But something tells me that if I hadn't screamed my lungs out when I did, I might not be telling this story the same way, or at all. Before we begin, I want to give some context. I'm from South Africa. In the area where I live, we have this thing called load shedding. It's where the government turns off the power in certain parts of the town and city 2 times a day, usually early morning or midday, and then again in the afternoon or late at night, and it stays off for about 2 hours. Now, let's begin with a story. It was mid-December, roughly a week before Christmas. My mother and sister decided to take a little trip for a week, leaving me alone to look after the house and take care of the dog. I was cool with it, mainly because I wasn't really a big fan of traveling. The first week and a half was fine. I mostly played video games in the living room and took my dog for his daily walk, always making sure I locked up my house before I left. My mother had left me some cash if I ever decided to order some takeout, and there was also plenty of frozen food in the freezer. However, things took a turn for the worse on that Thursday night. The electricity would be turned off for 2 hours between 10 p.m. and midnight. During the blackout period, I was chilling in my living room listening to a horror podcast on YouTube while waiting for the power to turn back on. It was about an hour later when I heard some commotion going on outside. At first, I thought it might have been my next-door neighbor's son coming home late like he normally does. To clarify, my neighbor has a gate that leads into their backyard, and that pathway is adjacent to the front of my house. The next thing I knew, it sounded like someone was tearing off the big tarp that covered our front gate. When I went to investigate, I would be lying to you if I told you that I wasn't scared. I could feel my heart beating out of my chest, and my hands were trembling as I looked out one of the front windows. To my horror, Someone had removed most of the tarp covering the front gate. No one was out there when I checked. I assumed that I had scared off whoever it was by using my phone's flashlight through the window. They may have been under the impression that the house was empty. If you're wondering where my dog was during all this, he was chilling in my mom's bedroom, which is located at the back of the house. I decided to have him join me in the living room so that he could keep me company, at least until the power came back on. I had this funny feeling that whoever had uplifted the tarp could still be somewhere outside. I continued listening to the podcast on my phone, and about 30 minutes later, I heard what sounded like the tarp being lifted off the fence again, but this time, my dog heard it too and began barking. So, I nervously opened my front door, ready to confront whoever it was trespassing on my property. I shouted, "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I would also like to mention that the breed of my dog is a border collie. Despite him being quite small, he has an intimidating bark that sounds like a German shepherd, especially in the dark. The next thing I knew, I heard several sets of footsteps running away. I went out to my front yard to investigate further. The intruders had torn off most of the remaining tarp. I decided to rip down the rest, as it would have to be replaced. That's when I noticed that the gate was hanging loosely on its hinges, indicating that they may have been trying to steal the gate and sell it for scrap. The very next day, my mother and sister came back from their trip. I told them about what happened. The following day, I was sent to a shop to purchase a security lock that came with an alarm. So if somebody tries tampering with it, or tries to remove the gate, the alarm will go off. I know that the story doesn't seem all that scary, but hearing something outside your house in the pitch dark was quite frightening to me at that moment. I have heard many stories of home invasions and murders happening during the blackout periods, so I consider myself very lucky. I'm an American-born woman, but my mother is from South Africa. She immigrated to the States in the 1990s. When I was growing up, she always taught me to be on guard and to be extremely cautious. It was simple things like driving up to an ATM at night. While my mom was using the machine, I had to look out one of the windows, while my sister would look out another, so that we could see if someone was coming. I had always wanted to visit South Africa, and when I was 17, I went as a graduation present. I ended up staying with my grandparents, who were both in their late 70s. My grandmother was hell-bent on showing me as much of the country as possible, even though my grandfather's Alzheimer's was worsening, and traveling for him was becoming much more difficult. Regardless, we took off from Johannesburg, heading toward Cape Town. We would drive up to 6 hours at a time. Anyone who has ever been to South Africa knows that you can go hundreds of miles and see nothing but grass. It was incredibly scenic, but also eerie. Once we got to Cape Town, we began passing signs that said, "Do not pull over for people selling grapes." We were near the vineyards, and people would sometimes steal the grapes and then try reselling them on the side of the road. It was around 3 or 4 that day. My grandfather was becoming antsy. He was fidgeting with the GPS of the car, plugging it in and unplugging it again, cursing and getting frustrated. Eventually the thing just kept repeating, recalculating, over and over again. My patience was wearing thin. I was trying to take it from him so that I could fix it, but he wouldn't let me touch it. Eventually my grandmother had enough and pulled over. This stretch of road was narrow and was lined by trees. Since it was around mid-afternoon, we were the only car in sight, and it was quiet. My grandparents were reading the GPS instructions and arguing with each other. My grandmother then turns around. "Can you keep watch out of the back window?" I kind of smiled to myself, remembering what my mom used to tell me. I glanced at my phone, which had no signal, then scrolled through my camera roll. I casually looked up and turned towards the back window. That's when my heart stopped. A man had emerged from the forest and was running, full sprint, towards our car. I found my voice and yelled, "Go!" to my grandmother. Her instincts kicked in, and we took off. As we drove away, the man just stood there and watched us. My grandmother explained that when travelers would pull over for the grape sellers, there would be people waiting in the trees who would come out to rob you. It doesn't get much more vulnerable than a teenage girl with an elderly couple, one of which was suffering from Alzheimer's. I'm incredibly grateful to my mother and my grandmother for teaching me to be cautious. This story happened over 10 years ago when I was still a student. It does contain a few details of graphic violence and animal cruelty, so discretion is advised. A bit of backstory. As is the case with most students, I was always broke. I had a few ventures apart from my part-time job to bring in extra money. One of them was house and pet sitting. I've always had a love for animals, so when this couple contacted me to house sit for them while they were away on an overseas trip, I jumped at the opportunity. The last sitter had bailed on them, leaving a 6-month-old golden retriever all alone. The fact that they promised to pay me the full 2-week fee for staying just a few days was all the more appealing. Little did I know how bad this would all turn out. I got the details and the keys from the agent and headed over to the house. I arrived there after 5 p.m., and it was almost dark. This was around early springtime. It was a very nice place, but it bordered a not-so-good area that was very prone to crime, house break-ins and robberies, etc. This didn't bother me much, because I thought that nothing would happen to me. I know, I was young and naive. The first 4 nights went smoothly. I watched movies, relaxed in their jacuzzi, and just generally enjoyed myself. The owners wouldn't be returning until the 5th day, fairly late at night. On the last day, I get a call from them at about 10 p.m. They said that their flight would be delayed, and that they were going to stay at a hotel and do a 3.5-hour drive back the following morning. They asked if I could sleep there again one more night, which was fine by me. I had already been staying there and still had my overnight gear. I called my dad to let him know about the change of plans. I was still living with my parents at the time. He specifically asked me for the address. I normally didn't want to give him details like that, because I thought I was old enough to look after myself. But I still believe to this day that probably saved my life. I eventually go to sleep at around 1 a.m. It felt like I was only down for 5 minutes when I hear a window breaking. As soon as I sat up, I heard what sounded like footsteps rushing down the hallway. The first thing I did was grab my phone and hit the redial button. My dad was the last number I called, and I was hoping that he would wake up as soon as he heard his phone ringing. However, when I was getting myself off the bed, I dropped the phone and it slid between the headboard and the mattress. But I did not hang up. If my dad picked up, he would be able to hear what was going on. A man then stormed into the bedroom. I could see that he had a knife in his hand. When he saw me, he raised it above his head and came at me. One thing that I forgot to mention is that this story takes place in South Africa, and unfortunately South Africa has a lot of crime. The robberies and home invasions are usually very brutal and violent. People are murdered and tortured if they retaliate in the slightest or don't cooperate with the intruders. I fell back onto the mattress, and out of instinct, once he came within reach, I kicked out both legs as hard as I could. Now, I'm not a small guy, I'm 6'3", and at this time I weighed about 220 pounds, and I was fit and strong. When I wasn't at school or working, I was usually at the gym lifting weights. At that time I could easily bench 250, and my squat was about 350. When my foot made contact with the intruder, it completely lifted him off the ground and sent him flying into the wall. Luckily, the knife fell out of his hand as well. Before he got a chance to get up, I was on top of him, driving my right knee into his face. I knew that my life was hanging in the balance, so I put some extra force into it. The guy dropped like a sack of potatoes. But before I could get up, I heard the sound of a slide racking back on a pistol, and I froze. It felt like all the blood drained from my body, and I became numb. I remember the only thing that went through my head was that if I was shot, I would rather die than be disabled. The second intruder held the pistol against my head for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 10 seconds. He eventually spoke in broken English. He told me to get on the bed and face down. I was panicking, but I knew he would shoot me if I did not comply, so I did as he said. He threw the blanket over me, and I turned into the fetal position with my back against the wall, just so if he wanted to stab me, my legs and arms would protect my body. Now, during all this commotion, I had completely forgotten that I called up my dad, and he could hear everything that was going on. I heard a third man come into the room. I heard him talking to the man with a gun. It sounded like he was speaking Portuguese. I didn't understand what he said, but I could vaguely recognize the dialect. The man who had entered the room tried to get the first guy off the ground, while the other began to ransack the house. It was about this time that I heard tires screeching as a car pulled up outside the house. I soon heard someone shouting. It took me a second to realize that it was my dad. The three men inside the house began to panic and ran out of the back door, but my dad opened fire, shooting in their general direction. Now, I do know that my father missed them on purpose, because if he had wanted to shoot them, he would have. He's ex-military and an expert marksman who has won shooting competitions in the past. However, given the politics of South Africa, along with the racial divide, he would have been in big trouble if he had actually killed one of them, regardless of the circumstances. When it was all over, we called the police and walked out to my dad's car to wait for them. It took them over an hour to get there. There was some excuse about having no vehicle when the call came in. By that time, I had calmed down and began looking for the dog. I couldn't find her anywhere. I borrowed a flashlight from my dad and started scanning the surrounding yard. As I got to the corner, I saw her lying on the ground. She was dead. The police found a few pieces of meat that were laced with poison. This is a pretty common practice for criminals around here. It's a way for them to deal with watchdogs at a place that has been targeted for a robbery. I was fuming. The police turned out to be pretty useless as well. They really didn't even seem to care. By that time, the sun was beginning to rise. I retrieved my bag, phone, locked up the house as best as I could without touching anything, and drove home behind my dad. It was only when we got back that I got my dad's side of the story. He said when he answered my call, the only thing he could hear was shouting and what sounded like fighting going on. When I didn't respond to him, he flew out of the house and raced over. Luckily, he asked me for the address earlier that night, and he knew the area well enough to know exactly which house it was. Now, my dad got there pretty quickly. He stayed on the line the entire time, only hanging up when he stopped at the gate. My parents' house is about 6 miles from there, through a residential area. It was normally about a 20-minute drive. The call duration was 7 minutes and 13 seconds. I met a detective there later that day and gave my full statement. The owners got back around the same time. The rest of that day is a blur. as I was coming down from all the shock and adrenaline. Now, this is not where the story ends. About 7 or 8 months later, I got a call from the detective, telling me that they had caught the guys, and I have to come into a lineup to point them out. I specifically told her that I didn't see any of their faces, as it was dark, and after the guy had held a gun against my head, I had a blanket thrown over me. I could only hear what was going on. I couldn't see anything. She reassured me that they had matched the fingerprints and would show me their photos before the lineup. You may be thinking that this was a bit unethical, but this is South Africa. Things work differently here. They wanted to have as much evidence as possible against them, and you'll understand why in a minute. When I got to the station, it's not like you see in the movies. There's no one-way glass or a separate room. They bring the guys into the same room and have them stand against the wall. The one that I was told was their leader was the man that I had kneed in the face. He looked at me with more hate I had ever seen in my life. He had the eyes of someone that would slit your throat and not blink an eye. His name was Joseph Dragon Sambo. He slid a finger across his neck and made a throat-cutting gesture. You know what I'm talking about. When he left the room, the detective gave me a copy of his rap sheet. He was a real model citizen. 4 counts of murder, 8 or 9 counts of attempted murder, multiple assault charges, over 100 house break-ins, and of course, sexual assault. I was shocked. The detective told me that if I had not taken him out first like I did, I probably would not be alive today. This is also not where the story ends. 3 days later, I get a call from the detective, saying that I should be careful, as he had escaped from custody, and they haven't been able to track him down yet. I was not worried about it too much, as the robbery was not at my house, and I had switched vehicles, so he probably wouldn't be able to locate me. Also, I had obtained my firearms license and carried a pistol on me 24/7. I didn't hear any updates about it until 2 years later, when I saw the detective at a grocery store. We started chatting about the case, and she told me that he was killed during a home invasion. It turns out he broke into the wrong house, and the owner was waiting for him. He was shot 1 time in the stomach and once in the neck, and thanks to the slow response of the emergency services, he died on the man's living room floor, ridding society of a piece of human garbage. Before we wrap things up, I want to add a bit more information. The 3 men who robbed that house were illegal immigrants from Mozambique. It is a widely accepted opinion in South Africa that over 70% of the violent crime is committed by illegal immigrants, mostly Zimbabwean, Nigerian, and Mozambican descent. Things are set up in such a way that it is easy for them to exploit the system, as none of those countries have an extradition treaty with South Africa. So if things get too hot, they can just flee back over the border and nothing can be done to them. This whole ordeal has made me more vigilant, heightened my situational awareness, and has also made me a bit more paranoid. I now double and triple check all the locks on my doors at night. The flip side is that I have been able to detect and remove myself from a few potentially dangerous situations. I have since immigrated to a safer country. If I hear the slightest noise happen at night, I wake up. Fortunately, Joseph is no longer with us, but to his other 2 cronies, please do stop by sometime. I will arrange your swift departure and reunion with Joseph in hell. The following story occurred in the summer of 2005. I lived in Athens, Georgia, and attended the University of Georgia. At the time, my girlfriend, now wife, lived in Atlanta, which was about a 65-mile drive from my hometown. The highway which takes you to Atlanta from Athens is a 2-lane highway called 316. This is important information for the story. It was a Sunday evening. I had spent the weekend in Atlanta and was now driving back to Athens. In the summer, there are very few cars on the road on Sunday evenings, as many of the students go home for the summer. I was driving a black BMW SUV and was cruising along listening to music. I saw no cars for miles and was approaching a traffic light along 316. The traffic light was red, and I came to a stop alongside an old Mustang. It looked like one of those models from the 1980s, was black in color with a rag top. The windows of the vehicle were tinted. I didn't really give the car a second thought. I just sat there and waited for the light to turn green. When it did, the Mustang suddenly sped off with a squeal of the tires. As if the driver floored it from the idle position, the car sped off far in front of me. I was a bit surprised, but I just thought, another redneck, who cares? The Mustang was soon out of sight and out of mind. I continue driving along, and I'm back in chill mode again, when suddenly, a car with its high beams on appears directly behind me. What the hell? I quickly realized it was the same Mustang from before. They had been waiting alongside the highway for me. I nervously looked down to make sure my phone was still charging, just in case I needed it. It was. The Mustang switches lanes and flies up beside me, keeping pace for a few seconds. The driver then swerves in front of me, then suddenly brakes, bringing the car to a halt. I swerve into the other lane. The Mustang quickly speeds up beside me and starts swerving, trying to knock me off the road. They charge ahead again and try the same braking maneuver once more. At this point, I am freaking out. Now, I'm a 6'3", 220-pound male who works out all the time. I don't easily get scared. But in this situation, size did not matter. I note the license plate on the car and grab my phone. But as I do, the Mustang is suddenly beside me again and begins swerving. I jerk my wheel to the side, and my phone goes flying out of my hands into the passenger side door well. Shit! The Mustang is then behind me, flashing its brights, right on my bumper, speeding up, slowing down, blaring its horn, swerving from side to side. They suddenly take off and are soon out of sight. I take the opportunity to collect myself and drive the remaining 10 minutes to the turnoff road to Athens. I make a quick decision to drive to the police station to file a report. I had the license plate number memorized and had been reciting it over and over again. As I turn off the road to Athens, bright headlights fill my rearview mirror again, and the Mustang is behind me. It speeds past me, turns down another road, and is gone. I arrived at the police station and give them the license plate number. It's a fairly small station, and I think there was only one officer working. He tells me that it's probably somebody mistaking me for somebody else. He runs the plate number and tells me the owner of those tags is deceased. Holy shit. Now I'm really freaked out. I finish filing the report and head home. The story doesn't end there. Later that night, when I was on the phone with my girlfriend, someone outside beats loudly on my garage door several times. Before I could get out to see who it was, I heard a squeal of tires. I never saw a car, but I called the cops immediately, and there has never been any kind of follow-up. I didn't sleep for several nights after that. A few years ago, I worked at a Jewish summer camp in northern Georgia. As many of you might know, Georgia is a fairly conservative state, as well as being predominantly Christian. There are small Jewish communities in a few summer camps. I would say this camp was more culturally Jewish than it was religious. Rather, it was a place for kids who were often in the minority to come and meet other kids like them. The staff was from all over. We had many Australians, a lot of Brits, a few Israelis, and some other people from various areas of the United States. Each night at around 10 p.m., most of the staff was able to go out on the town for a couple of hours. Of course, some of us remained behind to watch the cabins, and we would rotate. On this particular night, a group of about 5 of us decided to go to a local bar and grab a few beers. It had been a hot day, and it was a humid night, so we decided to sit outside on the patio. Most of the time, we were extremely well received by the locals. We brought in lots of revenue for the town during the summer. We bought supplies at the local stores and would rent canoes for the campers, and occasionally went out for dinner after a long hike on the Appalachian Trail. It was midsummer, so we had already been out to the bars in this area many times before. The 5 of us sat around a table, drinking and discussing the events of the day, as fellow employees typically would do after work. About 30 minutes into this, a guy who I would say was in his 20s came up to our table. I distinctly remember a jagged scar on his cheek, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After introducing himself, he told us that he was having a party at his place. He said that everyone was welcomed. Whites, blacks, gay, straight, it didn't matter. I found it kinda odd he felt the need to specify. But our group was a few beers in at this point, and were feeling pretty loose. He went on for a bit longer, and nothing really seemed off. We told him we worked at a summer camp in the area, and that we couldn't stay out too late, and we would have to head back soon. About an hour later, we were ready to leave. Our group exited the bar into the parking lot. As we approached the car, we saw that same guy come out of the shadows. He was with someone with a shaved head. They had a look of pure hatred in their eyes. He pounded his fist into his hand, then took off his shirt, revealing a crude Nazi tattoo on his chest. My stomach dropped. One of the bigger guys in our group, Kevin, immediately reacted by pulling a knife out of his back pocket. At summer camp, most of the staff carried knives. We usually used them for building fires. We asked them what they wanted, and they began shouting anti-Semitic remarks at us, and that they were going to beat us down. Kevin began walking toward the 2 men, but we restrained him. Suddenly, more men began walking into the parking lot. What happened next is a bit of a blur. I remember us being almost surrounded, pulling Kevin into the car, and rocks bouncing off the windows as we sped off. My heart was practically beating out of my chest. We never went back to that bar. On the bright side, when we shared this story at the only other bar in town, the bartender lined up 6 shots for us and said that we would always be welcomed at his place and this town. This happened a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent. I was a mother in my early 30s who had just driven my kids to the pediatrician. The doctor's office was in Macon, Georgia, and was about an hour away, and I was taking the 2 youngest of my 3 to our scheduled appointment. At the time, they were ages 1 and 3. Because we lived so far away, their office gave us the last 2 appointments of the day, and I was grateful for that. The doctor had just built a new facility off the highway, so the location was quite isolated in every direction. But it was a very nice building compared to his old spot by the hospital. His new building was also pretty far back on the new lot. My black Jeep Cherokee was only one of 4 or 5 cars in the lot when we arrived. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seats, and for the next hour or so we waited, then saw the doctor, paid, and we were finally heading back outside. By this point, my Jeep was the only one left in the parking lot. I loaded up the children into the car seats for the long trip home, but as the receptionist locked the front glass doors, my car, for some reason, would not start. Whenever I turned the key, there was just this odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the front door until someone allowed us back inside. and I asked to use their phone so I could call a nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book. Remember those? The attendant I spoke to on the phone said that he would be there, but that it might take a while. I told him my location and left to get back into the Jeep, rolled down the windows, and loaded the kids back into their car seats once more, and we waited. We watched as all the lights were turned out in the building, and everyone left, their cars departing one by one from the employee parking lot behind the building, leaving us completely alone. I spent a lot of the time trying to tend to the children, digging through our car for snacks and a bottle, and making sure they weren't getting too hot. Although the service station attendant said that he was probably going to be a while, I was surprised when I saw a truck pull into the empty lot, and pretty soon, a man stepped out. He smiled and nodded, and said that he was going to raise the hood. He was a middle-aged man, a bit scruffy looking. But honestly, most of the folks I know who work on cars often look like that, especially at the end of the day. I was just grateful that he was here working on the car. I sat down again in the driver's seat with the door open, waiting for him to tell me to try the engine. But he seemed to be taking a long time checking all the connections. I wanted him to just grab his jumper cables or something, but he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what was wrong. He responded, "Oh, it's just a loose wire. It's not the battery," and continued with whatever he was doing. I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through that long horizontal slit between the windshield and the raised hood. More than once, he said that it was just a loose wire. "Can you just come up here real quick and I'll show you which one, so that this never happens again?" I remember kind of smiling and shaking my head, saying that there was no reason to show me anything, as I know nothing about cars. I politely thanked him and stayed in the driver's seat. Again, just waiting for the inevitable signal to try to start the ignition. Surely that was coming any moment. At one point, I remember thinking that he was definitely flirting with me as he spoke. I was trying above all to be polite and kind, as I thought he was trying to help us, but we were hot and tired and miserable. And truthfully, I was distracted with the kids. He was beginning to sound a bit frustrated with me because I wouldn't get out and look at the engine. I remember thinking that I certainly didn't want to make him mad to where he left us all alone with the sun sinking so quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into the parking lot, and as it did, the man suddenly slammed the hood shut, ran to his truck, and quickly drove away without even saying goodbye. I was both confused and a bit anxious when he did this, because I didn't know who was arriving. I remember feeling a bit apprehensive that he had left me there all alone with my two little ones, completely defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay, or speak to whoever just pulled up? That certainly seemed like the gentlemanly thing to do. I looked around and was very aware. Once again, there were no visible cars on the road, no homes or businesses nearby, and the sun was continuing to set. It was near dark. As this new, unmarked pickup truck pulled up next to me, I got out of the car once again. This time I was a bit more apprehensive. Upon exiting, the man immediately introduced himself. His name and voice seemed to match who I had spoken to on the phone earlier. He actually called me by name and apologized for being so late. He then asked me who that man was who had just left. Relieved and unfazed, I just smiled back in surprise and told him, "Well, I don't know. I thought all this time he was you." We both laughed, and he grabbed his jumper cables, walked in front of my car, raised the hood, and began to work. I immediately sat back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that, with a bit of luck, the air conditioner will be blowing at full blast here shortly. While listening for the man to tell me to try the engine, I had my back completely turned as I was checking on the children. The man surprised me by suddenly coming near the driver's side door. He then said in a very concerned voice, Ma'am? Is this yours?" When I looked in his hands, he was holding a very long, dagger-like object that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered in rust. On one end, it had these tiny circular finger holes, as if it was a mix between a sword and a pair of scissors. I remember being amazed, but not frightened. I asked where he had found it. "It was under your hood." I just said, matter-of-factly, that I had never seen it before. He continued to stand there and stare at it. He looked oddly pale, as if he couldn't find the words to say, and just continued staring at the unusual object. Honestly, all I cared about was getting the Jeep started. Nothing else mattered. He didn't say anything else. He just set it on the curb, started his truck, and then signaled for me to start the Jeep. When the engine eventually started back up, my 3-year-old cheered. I quickly turned the AC on at full blast, rolled up all the windows, and aimed the air vents toward the back seat, and reached for my purse to pay. I got out of the car, took a few steps toward him so that he could tell me what I owed. He came back around to my driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, he walked right past me and picked up that strange object again. "Ma'am, I want you to look at these one more time." He held it out for a closer inspection. This time I moved a bit closer and really looked at it. In his hands, the item still appeared incredibly large, possessing an almost bayonet quality, except for the small loopholes at the end. I had never seen anything like it, and I told him so. As he held it, he spoke quietly, as if desperately trying to make me understand something that was somehow still going over my head. "These were not hidden in your engine, ma'am. They were sitting right on top, meaning that they had just been placed there." I shook my head and smiled. "They're obviously very old and rusty." To which he pointed more closely and replied, "Yeah, but do you see how sharp it is? This blade looks like it has just been sharpened." When I looked down, I could see that he was right. The long dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest quality was just how sharp it appeared to be. The edges at the tip where the rust had been removed was shining. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, and told me that I probably needed to contact the police when I got home, and then asked me where I wanted him to place the dagger. I didn't even want to take it with me, but I opened the back window so he could place it in the trunk. We left the lot together, him turning one way and me towards the other, heading down the small winding highway that led home, which was still an hour away. The moment that we arrived home and the children were safely inside, I did in fact contact the police. Although the officer on the phone listened politely, he declined when I offered to bring in the scissor-like sword. I was told that they sounded like they were a pair of specialized surgical shears based on my description and measurements over the phone, which I found to be quite disturbing. I remember wondering how he would even know that. I tried my best not to touch any of the surfaces, hoping that someday they might be able to lift off prints or test it for DNA. But the story seemed to bore the officer. He didn't really seem interested at all. His attitude insinuated that there was no longer an emergency, and this phone call was no longer important. At the very end of the call, as if to spice things up a bit, he did suggest that it sounded as if I was very lucky, and that I might want to hold on to the shears for a couple of days, just in case someone from his office got back to me later. I wrapped it carefully in newspaper and placed it in a brick storage unit behind our house. There they remained for several years, untouched, until we finally moved out. Not wanting to bring them across several states, I reluctantly threw them in the garbage. If you look through the old news reports, several women had gone missing all over the state of Georgia. Some bodies were eventually found, but others remain missing to this very day. I have often wondered what would have happened if that service attendant hadn't arrived when he did. If my children would still have a mother, if I would still have my son and daughter, if I would have missed all these years with them. I guess I'll never know. But I learned something very important about myself that day. I had always felt that I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading people, and staying safe. But because I was so exhausted and tired and hot and stranded in a different city, my common sense and intelligence simply left me for a while and wasn't working at that time. Many of my friends and family believe that our car trouble and my lack of awareness that day could have easily cost us our lives. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s. My childhood friend Joe and I were outside all the time. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty large forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we would pretty much play in the woods all weekend. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that came out around the same time. The idea was that we would walk on the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we would find a bridge to fish from, and maybe set up camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous, and we would likely be trespassing on somebody else's property, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun on our journey. We did locate the river, and discovered old bridges that nobody seemed to go to, and did some fishing. At night we camped in the woods near the tracks, and would build small campfires. Nothing crazy ever happened. It was ideal. In fact, it was so much fun that we did this multiple times, and we never had a problem. After graduation, Joe and I went our own ways. We both left our hometown, but always stayed in touch, and always tried to coordinate visits. One summer in the mid-90s, we both happened to be in our hometown for about a week. We spent some time with our families in the day, and at night, we would either stop at the local bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the good old days. One night, Joe and I got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer is one hell of a mix. It was decided that we would take a day before we left, walk on the tracks, and maybe camp out in the woods for one night. The day came, and we set out in the morning. We had my wife drop us off at our old starting point, just outside of our hometown. She thought we were absolutely nuts, and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, that we would go in the opposite direction, just to change things up. We knew the surroundings pretty well, and we had a map. So I said, "What the hell? Why not?" And we set off. The day went fine. It was fun, and a bit sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, talked, before moving on. We had no fishing gear this time around, but we did bring some canned food and other stuff. Before it got dark, we picked a spot to set up camp. It was a thick, forested area. Trees bordered the train tracks, so we felt like we were in a tunnel. We had brought some small hammocks to sleep in, but before we could set them up, we decided to do a bit of scouting on the perimeter. This is what we used to do back in the old days. We would walk around the area for a bit just to make sure we weren't intruding on somebody's property. We walked for maybe 100 feet or so into the woods, and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything at the top of this short hill, that we would be fine. However, when we reached the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do next. We both assumed it was just a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear path to it. From where we were, it did not look like it was occupied. No movement could be seen, and no lights. We decided to move a bit closer, just to be sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack. It appeared to be an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. The building was sagging, with wooden planks nearly black from all the years of moss and rot. A crucifix still stood at the top of the place, and was also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just an open doorway. We got close enough to see inside. There were still those rows of benches and a built-up section near the back, where the preacher stood. We didn't go all the way in, nor did we want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, no pathways leading to this place, no nearby roads. It was just an abandoned church sitting in the middle of the woods. We quickly left and climbed back up the hill to the spot we had chosen to camp at. Having the hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a bit creeped out. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness of seeing an abandoned building sitting in the middle of the forest. Besides, at this point it was near dusk, and we had hung up our hammocks, and were ready to go to sleep, and would be moving on early the next morning. Night fell, and as we lay in our hammocks, making small talk, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went something like this. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah. What the hell was it?" "It sounds like people singing." That was what I said at the time, but it didn't actually sound like singing. We both got out of our hammocks and hunkered down, and carefully listened for the next minute or two. The singing continued. Finally, it was decided that we would creep back down the hill and see if we could spot where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in these woods. It was second nature to us at this point. The moon was barely visible and provided just enough light so you could make your way through the trees. But truth be told, in certain spots, it was almost pitch black. For obvious reasons, we did not use our flashlights as we slowly crept up the hill. As we made our way up the hill, we didn't chatter. When we got to the top, we saw a light in the distance. It was coming from that old church, and the strange noise was resonating from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a very hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light that we saw appeared to be coming from candles by the way it flickered, and though we tried, we could not make out what was being sung. Rather, chanted. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see what was taking place inside, having absolutely no intentions of getting any closer. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit longer, and then suddenly stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant.
Sois los corderos de un dios inexistente creado por el hombre. Gozad hasta saciaros de este sagrado banquete.
This voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in the movies. But again, he was speaking in a different language. I couldn't understand a single word he said. Eventually it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song.
Ahora estás aquí en este lugar, porque la grandeza de la mano de Dios quiso que así fuera tu destino. Nosotros somos tu sangre. Eres el rey de la codicia.
Morir es vivir. Morir es vivir.
¿Te horroriza lo que ves? ¿Más que a ti mismo? ¿Es por lo sobrenatural de nuestro ser? ¿O por el futuro que estás a punto de emprender?
Morir es vivir. Morir es vivir.
This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wailing. That just kept getting louder and louder. It got so loud and disturbing that I had to cover my ears until it finally stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say that we needed to get the hell out of here, when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "Look, they're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them all out, but we did see a line of figures walking out of the open doorway. All of them were holding hands single file. We could see that they had flashlights. They were beginning to sing again, as the flashlight beams began moving toward the hill. Toward us. We booked it back to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once we were there, we ran down the tracks in the direction that we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. To our horror, we saw the lights moving down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was running. We continued to run in short bursts and walked fast as we catched our breaths, and we eventually stopped seeing the lights. According to our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes away from here. We walked down the road and got to a 24-hour gas station and called my wife to come pick us up. My wife and other friends that I have told this story to think that it was probably just kids messing around. But I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. I'm not entirely sure who those people were, but this was definitely the creepiest experience that has ever happened to me out in those woods. Near where I live, there is a glorified gravel path through some woods called Rube Hill. It runs for about 3 miles. Only half a mile of it is paved. On the south end is pavement, with a few old but otherwise normal houses dotting it. Deceptively average at that point. Then the houses end, along with the pavement, and the gravel road shoots up a steep hill. It's not taken care of at all, so unless you're driving an off-road vehicle, you would want to be very careful. So since you would need to drive slowly, you would get a nice clear view of the homemade signs nailed to the trees with messages like, "No trespassing," and "We are watching you," scrawled with a permanent marker. At the top of the hill, the road winds lazily for almost a mile, before driving back down the other side of the hill. The gravel is in equally poor condition on the other side as well. Once you reach the bottom, the road cuts straightish for about a mile, through cornfields, before intersecting with another road. The reason I'm so familiar with the layout is that I have often taken friends on late-night drives to this road, just to scare the crap out of them. It was never much of an elaborate prank. I would just slowly drive up the hill and play creepy music to get them amped up and paranoid. I always made sure to bring up the meth heads and their nearby labs, and how the sheriffs try to avoid going here because it's dangerous. These are things that I've heard before as well. I figured it was all bullshit, just made up stories. But now I think there's an element of truth to some of these rumors. One night I was with my friend Aaron, and we decided to go on a late night drive to Rube Hill, just to freak ourselves out. So we took off, drove down the various country highways and back roads, and turned onto it, and eventually reached our destination. I made sure to play extra creepy music. Since Aaron and I had made this trip several times before, it honestly lost all of its creepy luster on me by then. But I still enjoyed these long drives and scaring my friends. We were almost across the hill, about to make our descent down the other side, when Aaron freaked out. I checked my mirrors to see what he was shitting his fist over, and saw the headlights of a truck. The truck was under the only street light on top of the hill. It was a really dim orange light, and I could see that it was kicking up a ton of dirt as it was speeding towards us. I paused the music, and sure enough, with the windows down, I could hear the gravel crunching and flying as the vehicle accelerated. Keep in mind that I have driven down this road many times, both day and night, and in all this time I have never encountered another vehicle. So seeing this truck tearing down the road, trying to catch up to us at midnight, was pretty jarring. Usually I didn't relinquish my brakes driving down that hill, but this time, I didn't even touch them. So, the following night, I'm hanging out with another friend of mine, Chris. We were just lounging about, playing video games, talking about quantum physics, Chris's favorite topic, and Chipotle, my favorite topic. I of course told him all about Aaron and I getting chased the previous night. I kinda hammed it up a bit, and made it come across a bit more harrowing than it actually was. But now Chris wanted to go down the road. We waited until late at night, I would say around 2 a.m., before we set out to Rube Hill. This time, I wasn't going to play my music. I wanted to be alert. Things were going normal at first, then I slammed on my brakes. I put the car in park and said, "You see that too, right?" I looked at Chris. He was just as confused as I was, and just nodded. My headlights were clearly illuminating a thick metal cable stretched across the road. On the right, it was wrapped around a tree, at what I'd guess was roughly head height for a standing adult. The other end was anchored to a fence across the road, at roughly chest height. I had no idea what to make of this or how to react. That's when I heard gravel being thrown by tires. I checked my mirrors, and sure enough, truck headlights were hauling ass down the road behind us. I began to freak out. My breathing and heart rate were out of control, and I broke out in a sweat. Chris just swore under his breath quietly. I put the car into drive, and pulled as far to the right as I possibly could, and my low-sitting car was able to slide under the cable with a loud metal-on-metal scraping noise. I cringed as I heard the scrape, but I wasn't about to sit there and get deliveranced. So again, I flew down the hill. And this is the creepy cherry on the sundae, for me personally, because Chris didn't see it. As we entered the cornfields, I glanced to my right and briefly caught a glimpse of somebody standing about 3 or 4 feet back in the corn. I just felt my stomach scrunch up and floored the accelerator. I then glanced into my rearview mirror, and I could see the man now standing on the road behind us, illuminated by the moonlight. He had a long object slung over his shoulder. I couldn't tell if it was a cane or perhaps a rifle, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. By the time I told Chris about it, we were already around the bend and out of sight. I haven't been back there since that night. There is a hiking trail near my school. It's about 2 miles to the top, with a wonderful view of the entire valley. My friends and I like to go there from time to time, whenever we got bored. One Saturday evening, we set off. The sun was beginning to set, right as we started the 2-mile walk through the forest. It was terrible timing, but we all knew this trail. Everything started off normal, but I began to get creeped out as it continued getting darker. I'm a paranoid person by nature, and that didn't help matters when suddenly one of our group says, "What's that?" I don't have the best eyesight, and I couldn't really see what they were referring to. "I think it's a girl," another friend said. By this point, I was thoroughly freaked out. It was 9 p.m. on a dark hiking trail. It was the kind of setting straight out of a slasher film. We moved closer, and my eyes eventually adjusted enough to the darkness. There was a young woman sitting on a pile of leaves, with her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth, wearing only a dirty pink nightgown. She did not acknowledge us. "Should we go try to help her?" I don't know. It looks like she's having a bad trip. My friend gave me these mushrooms one time and Would you guys shut up? I think she has a knife." I strained my eyes to see, but she did appear to be cradling a knife in her lap. "Oh, fuck this. I'm out of here." Most of our group were now thoroughly frightened. We picked up our pace and headed back downhill, constantly checking our phones, but of course, there was no signal. "I think you guys are being a bit dramatic. That girl back there was just having a bad trip. Oh, and I suppose that she brought that knife along just to pick out the dirt in her fingernails. You're an idiot." I'm just saying that she might not be a danger." "Shut up. Someone's coming." We soon encounter a man, frantically running up the trail. "Excuse me, have any of you seen my daughter?" At the time, my paranoia got the best of me. I was thinking that we might have seen somebody who had escaped her kidnapper. The girl we saw had to be at least in her early 20s. She was not a child or a teenager. No, we haven't seen anyone out here." The man then took off and disappeared down the trail. As you can guess, we all ran the rest of the way back. Unfortunately, the cell service didn't return until we got back into the car, but we did call and report what we saw to the police as soon as we could. They searched the area, but we never heard any kind of update. I don't know what was happening in those woods that night, but I hope that girl got some help, and that man we encountered was just a concerned father.